So at this point, we've discovered what nodes are alive on the network and maybe a little bit of information about them. We're ready to move to the next point, which is where we want to get as much detail as possible. And the next step is kind of tossed back and forth between the names service enumeration and fingerprinting. And the reason that there's some confusion there is we've determined the live hosts on the network. Now we want to discover what's actually running on those hosts. In other words, I might be running a web server, a database server, and maybe a network file system server. Well, by discovering that type of information, it usually helps us in identifying or fingerprinting the operating system and associated applications. In addition to the service enumeration process, discovering those services, we might be able to discover specific versioning information about those services, which is also sometimes called fingerprinting the service. And the concept here is we want to gather the information about what's running on the system, and we want specifics. In other words, IIS 5.0 is running on this system. We discovered that while fingerprinting the IIS service discovered during service enumeration. This tells us that the operating system is Windows 2000. Again, part of the fingerprinting process. So now you can kind of get an idea of why we decided to combine service enumeration and fingerprinting into one logical step, because they definitely overlap in a significant way. Now, for the most part, the reason that we want to discover the services, information, and the fingerprinting is that we want to understand what potential vulnerabilities might be running on that server and how we might exploit them. A great example is, let's go back to the IIS 5.0 example. So, starting from the very beginning, we do a little reconnaissance, we check out that they have a web server, we decide to scan the web server, it finds the host as being up, gives us an IP address, and then we perform the enumeration / fingerprinting of that system. Basically just poking and prodding to see what we can find from outside the box. We discover that it is running an IIS 5.0 server on port 80. Again, probably picked up by either scanning or service enumeration. By understanding that, we now know that we have a web server, obviously. We have an open port, port 80. We have a vulnerable service that is running on that system. IIS 5.0 has hundreds and hundreds of vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited. And because we know that that's 5.0, we now know that it's hosted on a Windows 2000 box, which in itself has hundreds and hundreds of vulnerabilities that could be exploited. So as you can see, this process is basically giving us a little bit of information on what we could potentially do to that box to exploit it and gain access to it. For the most part, usually some of the tools that you're going to use are going to include fingerprinting, service enumeration, and scanning all in one. A great example of this is going back to Nmap. Nmap has the capability to scan all ports on the system. And if you're not already familiar with ports versus services, generally a port, which is a number associated to a service running on that operating system. So by doing a port scan in combination with a ping sweep with Nmap, we can determine what hosts are alive and what is running on those hosts.